want to welcome you here in another of the Global Affairs and Public Policy School the lecture series. We have made it a point to start to get as diverse as we can in terms of the topics we address, and to try to take advantage as much as we could of the presence of distinguished speakers traveling into Egypt from abroad in order to ensure that we bring the best and the brightest to the AUC community, and also to allow them a chance to engage directly with students and faculty and researchers here at the university. Today the topic we will be dealing with is more in the security, human operation field. We have a distinguished professor from Professor Philipp Bleek. He's the research fellow of the project on managing the ATOM, the International Security Program at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard. He will be an assistant professor at the Monterey Institute for International Studies very soon in Monterey, California. And it is one of the most distinguished institutes that deals with proliferation in particular, and we have several specialist centers there. He's here to speak to a topic that's very prominent and dear to the hearts of many Egyptians, the whole issue of nuclear non-proliferation, how we dealt with the consequences and circumstances in our region. What I'd like to do to take advantage of the time that we have, it's a bit short given that Phil has lost on AUC campus. So what I'd like to do is to invite Dr. Bleek to come and speak to you on these issues for about 20-25 minutes, and then give you another 20-25 minutes to ask questions. He's agreed to do that in that sequence. Dr. Bleek?
Let me just start by thanking Ambassador Fahmy for the very generous invitation. And I should also acknowledge Ambassador Mohammed Shakir, who was the one who originally invited me to come to Cairo. The two of us were together at a meeting sponsored by the Turkish Foreign Ministry in Istanbul. And that was the sort of original context that motivated me to try to come here. This is my first time to Egypt. It's been fascinating and fun, perhaps a little bit overwhelming. My hotel is on Tel Afar, near Midan Tel Afar, and as you know, that's a very busy, noisy street. So I was thinking if I say anything really crazy today, I blame the fact that very early this morning, the traffic on Tel Afar woke me up. But my friends tell me I'm already crossing the street like a local. So I think when I go to Berlin in a few days, it will be dangerous. I will have to unlearn some of these habits. Let me say a couple things before I get into the substance. So thank you for the very kind introduction. And as it apparently says on the poster as well, I did work for now President Obama during his campaign on his foreign policy team on these issues. And so I think it's very important for me to be very, very clear that I am speaking here in an entirely personal capacity. I do not work for President Obama now. I have no formal affiliation with the administration. So this is me as an academic. So I just, right up front, I think I need to be very careful about that. And that is Harvard as well. I really am speaking for myself. Second, I recognize that I'm speaking about quite controversial issues. So I'm speaking about the Israeli nuclear weapons program. I'm speaking about some efforts that Egypt may have made in the nuclear weapons realm. We'll talk more about that in a sec, but I just want to acknowledge that they're controversial issues. These are my interpretations. To the extent that you disagree with them, I would love to hear that, because that's what I'm here for. This is really related to that. This is a research project very much in progress. I'm here to do some interviews. I'm interested in your feedback. I don't speak Arabic, so you have access to sources that I do not have access to. So let's have a conversation. I'll give a little talk, but the part that I'm really interested in is what we do afterwards, which is to say the kind of Q&A and back and forth. And please, if you think I'm wrong, if you think I got something not quite correct, let me know that, because I appreciate that. So let me start. So there's a kind of a conventional wisdom in Washington. And it's remarkably widespread. So it's been articulated recently by people on a spectrum as wide. At one end, John Bolton, who was President George W. Bush's very controversial UN ambassador, and also was one of the senior officials in the State Department working on these issues. But it's also been articulated by President Obama at the the other end of the spectrum and others, there's a kind of conventional wisdom that if Iran keeps doing what it's doing, which is to say, it appears to at least be pursuing a nuclear weapons option. Now, how far it goes is unclear, I would say, at this point. Other states in the region will do the same. And the three states that are most commonly suggested to be likely to pursue their own nuclear weapons in response to Iranian proliferation are Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egypt. So, for example, John Bolton just wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal arguing precisely this. This conventional wisdom is remarkably widespread. My own sense is that it's flawed. And if you like, during the Q&A, we can unpack that a little bit more, because I just finished my PhD dissertation on this broader topic of whether and under what conditions states pursue and acquire nuclear weapons in response to proliferation by rivals. But that's not the topic of my talk today. So today what I'm going to talk to you about is one of the case studies from my dissertation, where I looked at Egypt's response to Israeli pursuit of nuclear weapons, beginning in the mid to late 1950s and extending through the negotiation of the peace in the late 1970s. And in a sense, the kind of core puzzle here for me is, why didn't Egypt do more? Now, it's more complicated than that, and I actually think Egypt did something in this realm, and I'll talk to you about that, and possibly that'll be a controversial argument. But that's what I want to talk to you about. So it's very much a historical case. Now, I think it's intrinsically interesting historically, but I think it is also not irrelevant for the dilemmas that we face today, for a couple of reasons. One, Egypt, as I mentioned, is one of the countries that, at least in the U.S., in this kind of simplistic discourse, is sometimes highlighted as a country that may wish to pursue its own nuclear weapons in response to Iran, depending on what Iran does. So in that sense, I think this is useful, right? The way in which Egypt responded to Israel, I think, is a useful lesson for how it might respond to Iran, although those two situations are different, and we can talk about how they're different. Two, if one is thinking about broader Middle Eastern proliferation dynamics, I think this case has at least some potential to shed some light on those dynamics. And more broadly, I think it's a useful case for this broader question of how do states react when their very intense rivals pursue nuclear weapons. So in the next sort of 20-25 minutes or so, I'll do a couple of things, but what I'm mainly going to do is walk through the case. In other words, the story of how Egypt responded to Israeli proliferation. I'm interested in when Egypt knew what about Israeli proliferation, what sorts of debates took place within the Egyptian government. In other words, what the Egyptian government thought about doing in response, what it actually did. And these are tricky issues, because as you might imagine, it's hard to get traction on them. One can have conversations with some people who were involved at the time, who may be more or less forthcoming. Archival material is really not available to me. We have a relatively good secondary literature in the United States on this issue, but not as good as I would like. And so, as I mentioned, this really is a work in progress. You may be aware of people or sources that are not on my radar. I'd love to hear about them afterwards. So at the end of that, I'll highlight some conclusions both about the Egyptian case and about what I take to be the kind of lessons, the broader lessons from this case for the broader questions that we're interested in. I want to start with one clarification. I'm going to use the word proliferation a lot. And this is a confusing word because it means a couple different things. So when I use it, what I mean is actions that states take to pursue nuclear weapons themselves. I don't mean actions they take to share nuclear weapons with other states, which is another sort of widespread meaning of that term. So I just wanted to clarify that, because in the past when I've given lectures, that's sometimes confusing to me. And I also, when I use the word proliferation, I'm going to mean nuclear proliferation, unless I define it otherwise. So the story here really starts in 1948 with the establishment of the modern state of Israel. And the only really interesting kind of tidbit here for this story is that this is the conflict in which Nasser had his first battlefield experience, and he was also part of the Egyptian delegation to the ceasefire negotiations. And his participation in that delegation, I understand he found humiliating. So in a sense, this planted the seeds for the kind of later antagonistic relationship with Israel. But in the years immediately following that war, I guess Al-Nakba or the War of Independence, depending on which side of it you were on, Egyptian-Israeli relations were not so tense. I would say they simmered at a low level, but there was in fact a back channel that the Egyptians maintained, Nasser maintained, with the Israeli Prime Minister through the embassy in Paris. and relations were not so tense. And I think that, and the other kind of salient point here is that from the early days, I think Israeli leaders knew from the beginning that they eventually wanted to try to get nuclear weapons, but they didn't think they were ready to pursue them at that early phase. So the kind of next really interesting date for us is 1955. And it's interesting for at least two core reasons. One, this is a real turning point, I think, in Israeli-Egyptian relations. The key thing here, I think, is the Israeli attack on the Egyptian army headquarters in Gaza that killed a number of Egyptian soldiers, including a number of officers. This was in response to some guerrilla activity against the Israelis. And so, as I said, tensions had been simmering. But I think, at least from the Egyptian perspective, it's correct to say that this was a kind of a turning point. And the irony here is that this, I think, in part, is what motivated Nasser to sign subsequently a very large arms deal with technically with the Czech Republic, but de facto with the Soviet Union. And that, in turn, was part of the motivation for the Israelis to finally give their nuclear weapons program a push and really start it. So there's a kind of historical irony there. But the other really important thing that happened in 1955 is that Ben Gurion, who had been out of government for 2 years, living on a kibbutz, and sort of withdrawing and thinking, basically. You can think of the kibbutz as a kind of, I guess, an Israeli equivalent of a think tank. It returned to government as defense minister and then as prime minister. And this is when he made the decision to launch a nuclear weapons program. In 1955, whether you date that to 55 or 56, you could argue that a little bit, and it took it a few years to really get going. So 55 is kind of a key year for us. The program, as I said, took a little while to get going, and really the crucial breakthrough for it was technical cooperation with France. So France had been solidifying its relationship with Israel in the context of tensions with Egypt, with Nasser, over his perceived support for Algerian rebels in the French colony. And so the French had been increasingly bolstering their ties. And during the 1956 Suez crisis, those ties were really cemented, and that's the first time that informally the French said to the Israelis, "We will help you with your nuclear program." And very soon after that, they signed formal agreements, in particular to help the Israelis construct the reactor at Dimona that ended up being crucial to producing plutonium for the Israeli nuclear weapons program, and associated with processing facilities to extract the plutonium from that reactor. So construction on Dimona began in early 1958, and it proved quite difficult to hide. So I think well known that the United States very quickly got YouTube spy plane footage of the site. This was actually briefed to President Eisenhower intriguingly, or perhaps not so intriguingly. He had no response to it, no comment. He's usually a very, very engaged person in intelligence briefings. No questions, no White House follow-up. Hard to resist the conclusion that for Eisenhower personally, at least, he preferred not to know more at that point. But I think less well known is the fact that apparently Egypt had footage taken from overflights around the same time. And the only person who I've found this source to is Amin Huwaidi, who unfortunately passed away a couple years ago, who later served as both Minister of Defense and Minister of Intelligence, who at the time was Chief of Intelligence for the Army Staff, who claims to have been the first person to review these photographs and claims that they convinced him that the Israelis had launched a nuclear weapons program. There's another really interesting piece of intelligence that came in around the same time. An Egyptian scientist was working in an American nuclear lab, and he observed some Israelis working in the classified plutonium section. He had some conversations with American colleagues, and he wrote a letter back to the Egyptian government. This is a scientist who later would play a key role in the Egyptian Atomic Energy Commission, and he wrote a letter back to government and said that he thought the Israelis were pursuing a nuclear weapons program. So already in the late 1950s, there's intelligence coming in before the public revelation of Dimona, which I think is important because we sometimes think that Dimona was a kind of a shock for the Israeli leadership, and I think it was Egyptian leadership, and I think it was a shock for the Egyptian public. But I think the elites already in the late 1950s had a sense that Israel was going down this path. So in 1960, of course, Israel was forced to publicly acknowledge that it was constructing a reactor at Dimona. Of course, what it said in public was that this was an entirely peaceful reactor for civil research, for agricultural purposes, and so on. But one of the really interesting kind of quirks of this story is that while in public, That's what the Israelis claimed. In private, and even in some cases in public settings, they also purposely stoked Egyptian fears of Israeli liberation. So they would give interviews, so they would say, well, maybe our intentions are not entirely peaceful, and in a variety of ways stoked fears, and even more interestingly, the Americans at this time, and the Kennedy administration, had put in place a kind of inspection regime at Dimona where they would go regularly to Dimona, and the Israelis had a very sophisticated scheme where they would, for example, brick over the doorways to the key parts of the facility whenever they knew the Americans were coming. But the Americans wanted to reassure the Egyptians on the basis of these visits that actually the Israelis weren't doing anything nefarious in terms of pursuing the weapons. And interestingly, the Israelis resisted that repeatedly, and so there were some exchanges of letters between prime ministers and presidents on both sides where the Israelis said, no, actually, we want the Egyptians to think that maybe we're pursuing these weapons because we think that it strengthens our deterrence. I think that, to me, that argument's not terribly coherent, but interestingly, the Israelis are actually stoking fear in Egypt that they may be pursuing nuclear weapons. And of course, the Dimona revelation then went very public, so 2 days later, in his annual Victory Day speech, Nasser directly addressed this issue, and he said two things that are important. One, he said, if this is true and he means nuclear weapons, that means war between the two of us. And two, he said, if they get one, we will get one too. Pretty clear statement. Interestingly, the kind of statement that we heard out of Pakistan as it launched a serious nuclear weapons program. And I think it's pretty fair to conclude that by the early 1960s, Nasser knew that Israel was pursuing nuclear weapons. So I think the kind of conventional wisdom that the Egyptians didn't realize what the Israelis were doing, and that explains why they didn't do more, I don't think holds a lot of weight. And he could have read his intelligence reports, but he could have also read the newspaper at that point, I think, to reach that conclusion. And in fact, in 1963, Khrushchev was visiting, and Nasser told him, I know the Israelis are pursuing nuclear weapons. Pretty clear statement, pretty hard to misread that. So this raises a really interesting question. So Nasser says, if they get one, we will get one too. He knows they're pursuing one. How vigorously does Nasser, in fact, pursue nuclear weapons? And I would say the short answer is that what he said was, we will get one too at any price. So does he try to get one too at any price? And my sense is no. He does not try to get one at any price. I do think he tries to get one. This is potentially a controversial assertion, and I'd love to hear what you think about it. But my sense is that Nasser and some elements of his regime wanted nuclear weapons, but weren't willing to pay a very high price for them. So I'll talk a little bit more about why I conclude that and why I think that was the case. So I say that for a number of reasons. Egypt took a variety of steps to try to get nuclear weapons on the cheap. That is, without having to make costly trade-offs versus other national priorities. And actually, I think if Egypt had been much wealthier, more technologically developed, if it had been a little less unlucky in terms of procuring sensitive nuclear technology from other countries, I think Egypt might have actually obtained nuclear weapons. Whether it would have them today, we can debate. Those historical counterfactuals are very tough to play out. But that's sort of my read of the story. And let me tell you why I think that is. Egypt did develop a domestic nuclear infrastructure that would give it at least the option of a weapons program. And this is one thing that's clear very early on. So the early impetus from 1955 for the Egyptian nuclear program, I think, is really civil. Right? So the actual proximate impetus is an invitation to the United Nations conference. So the Egyptians are, there's this sense, there's this tremendous optimism about nuclear technology, atoms for peace. And so I think the early start of the program is completely civil. Very, very early on, there are debates within the program, and the program in particular is asking more senior government officials, how should we be thinking about this potential weapons option? In other words, should we be doing things to close the door? Should we be doing things to keep the door open? Not, should we develop nuclear weapons today, but how should we be thinking about this? And the answer they get is, for now, it's not your first priority, but please keep the door open. And in fact, please do things that make sure the door is open down the road. That's how I would interpret the kind of early activity in the late 1950s and early 1960s. So Egypt does a variety of things that are potentially weapons relevant. In particular, it tries to procure a reactor that's capable of producing substantial quantities of plutonium, and it tries to procure the technology to separate that plutonium. And some Egyptian government officials and military officials at the time have subsequently admitted in interviews that this was intended, in fact, to be a potential plutonium route to the bomb. So I'm not in any way saying that a decision had been reached that they wanted a bomb, but I think this was at least intended to hedge their bets. Further, in the 1960s, Egypt repeatedly sought reprocessing technology from a variety of different countries, the United States, India, China, at multiple points the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union actually at one point agreed to give it substantial reprocessing technology, but in the context of a reactor deal with Germany that ended up falling through. Beginning in 1960 and continuing throughout the 1960s, at pan-Arab meetings of the Arab League, Egypt repeatedly proposed a pan-Arab nuclear program. The idea was basically that nuclear weapons would be built in Egypt, but jointly financed by other Arab countries. We can talk about why if you like, but this idea didn't get a lot of traction within the Arab League. And Egypt repeatedly asked other countries if they would provide it with nuclear weapons technology and nuclear weapons. Now, some of these episodes are better chronicled than others. So there are insinuations that there was a group of German scientists who, of course, were involved with the missile program, but who were also involved with the nuclear program. I would say the evidence on that front is fairly sketchy. So maybe not. Certainly in 1963, visiting Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai was asked for assistance with nuclear weapons technology. In 1964, after China had conducted its first nuclear test, Egypt sent a delegation to China to congratulate it on the test. And China, of course, at the time had this rhetoric, which was, we will spread nuclear weapons to the other socialist countries. And so the Egyptians said, hey, we're a socialist country. Would you consider spreading nuclear weapons to us? That's not a quote. But along those lines, as I understand it, and were rebuffed. So the Chinese said, no, you need to be independent, you need to be self-sufficient. 1964, 1965, the same issue was again raised with the Soviet Union, again with little success. And then the kind of key next date that we get to is 1967. And in a sense, the 1967 war really transformed the landscape here. In particular, after the 1967 war, Egypt faced very significant resource constraints, right? Because it had lost access to canal revenue and oil revenue from the Sinai. Its conventional military forces had been decimated, and so the cost of rebuilding those was very significant. And so you saw the effect of this throughout the Egyptian government, including in the nuclear program, which at this point was basically confined to paper studies. So the nuclear program wasn't halted, but there was a sense that the program had to be dramatically scaled back. Nasser, in fact, met with Egyptian nuclear scientists and concluded at that meeting that Egypt could pursue nuclear weapons only if the national budget is cut in half to devote to the bomb. That was a quote. And decided that this would impose undue hardship on the Egyptian people. So decided not to go that route. One of the things that's interesting is that Pakistan, in 1972, after the 1970 war that created Bangladesh, was in a very, very similar position and acted very differently. So I think at a minimum it's there's a kind of assumption sometimes that the 67 war made it impossible for Egypt to pursue nuclear weapons. And I think that's not quite right. I think if it had been enough of a priority, and maybe Nasser's quote suggests that, right? It's sort of along the lines of Bhutto's famous quote, we will eat grass. We will cut the national budget in half, we could acquire nuclear weapons. So I think impossible is going too far, but certainly the constraints were quite dramatic at that point. Egypt was still nonetheless interested in nuclear weapons, and if anything, its relationship with Israel was more antagonistic. So this is a period when you could expect it, if it ever wanted nuclear weapons, to want them. So later in 1967, and also in early 1968, another Egyptian delegation apparently visited China, and again inquired about purchasing nuclear weapons technology. And it appears also complete nuclear weapons, and just as before, was rebuffed again. And similarly, Egypt reached out again to the Soviet Union for assistance in acquiring nuclear technology, and it appears also nuclear weapons again. That was a success. In 1968, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty comes online, so that's kind of our next turning point. And only months after Egypt had asked both China and the Soviet Union if they would sell it or transfer to it nuclear weapons, Egypt joined the NPT. And I think why Nasser joined the NPT is at least an issue that I don't have a lot of insight into. And I don't know if any of us have. Okay, so there's a distinction between signing the treaty and later ratifying. So So Egypt doesn't ratify the treaty for a long time. We'll get to that in a little bit. But why Nasser joined the NPT so early, not entirely clear. Certainly it's controversial within Egypt. If you have thoughts about that, love to hear more. We now know that Israel assembled its first rudimentary nuclear weapons in 1967, just before the 67 war. There's no reason, at least nothing that I have come across, to let us think that in Egypt there was knowledge of that. The Israelis don't appear to have communicated that to the Egyptians. But at the latest, by 1973, the Egyptians were aware that the Israelis had at least rudimentary deliverable nuclear weapons capability, and in fact factored that into their planning for the 1973 war. Of course, there's a crucial change here in between, which is that in 1970, Nasser dies and is replaced by his Vice President Anwar Sadat. And Sadat takes Egypt on a very different course, including on the nuclear issue. So Sadat was interested in revitalizing nuclear power, but he wasn't very interested in nuclear weapons. Now, why he wasn't very interested in nuclear weapons, I think, is still a live puzzle. And it's something I'd love to talk with you a little more. To the extent that I don't completely run out of time, I'll talk a little bit more about it now. But as you know, Sadat ended up, after the 1973 war, reaching out to Israel and ultimately making what's often called a cold peace with Israel, which has persisted to the present day. As part of those negotiations, the Egyptians tried quite hard to insert a commitment to denuclearization into the negotiations. That was rebuffed, and they were willing to go ahead with the negotiations despite the absence of that commitment. So the coda to the story, as one of our audience members mentioned, is that in 1981, Egypt finally ratified the NPT. So Sadat had convened a commission. It was headed by Boutros Ghali, a future UN Secretary General, whose mandate included assessing both whether Egypt could and whether it should develop nuclear weapons, and fundamentally whether it should not only sign but fully ratify the NPT. The commission concluded that it should, or Sadat at least took that from the Commission's final report, and Egypt subsequently joined the NPT. Let me try to kind of wrap up with a couple of conclusions about this story, and then talk about some of the broader implications, and then let's get to questions. First, how does the kind of conventional wisdoms about why Egypt acted the way it did fare? Well, there's one conventional wisdom, which is, as I mentioned, that Egypt didn't do more because it didn't know what Israel was doing. And I would say that conventional wisdom, to me, doesn't fare very well. So Egypt had a pretty good idea already in the late 1950s, intensified in 1960 with the exposure of pneumonia throughout 1960, and even Egyptian newspapers were full of articles about this issue. Certainly international newspapers like the New York Times were full of articles about this issue. But I think it's hard to argue that Egyptian policymakers really didn't realize that Israel was going down this path. And when they knew that Israel actually had nuclear weapons, is tough. At the latest, by 1973, probably not as early as 1967, somewhere in between. But I unfortunately have not been able to unearth a piece of information that suggests to me what the precise year was, and I'm not sure that it matters. But there's a grain of truth to conventional wisdom, which is that the fact that the Israelis chose to keep their nuclear arsenal opaque, which is to say not to publicly declare it, is not irrelevant to the story. Right? Egyptian policymakers would have faced much more pressure to match Israel if the Israelis had gone public. How much more pressure? Extremely hard to ascertain. It's counterfactual. But at a minimum, that is certainly not irrelevant to the story. It's not irrelevant to the way in which we might think about how the Iran situation could play out. Second conventional wisdom, Egypt tried seriously to get nuclear weapons, but it failed. Again, there's a grain of truth here, but I think on balance it's more false than true. Egypt tried, but it didn't try very hard, and it was consistently unwilling to make costly trade-offs. So the nuclear program is told to, as a lesser priority to pursue nuclear weapons, but once it's launched, for example, when the program has bureaucratic issues, Nasser really keeps a hands-off approach. He doesn't intervene. He doesn't push the program forward. It gets reasonable resources, but it's not highly resourced. It's not necessarily highly resourced next to other national priorities, like the missile program, the fighter jet program, domestic priorities like the Al-Samdan project. I mean, there are lots of things that the Egyptian government is spending money on. And so I think it's fair to conclude that Egypt could have gotten nuclear weapons cheaply. It might have gotten them. It would have been a little more lucky with sensitive technology. But I think this is overstated as an argument for why Egypt didn't get nuclear weapons. Finally, there's a conventional wisdom that, but there's a grain of truth here too, which is that I do think Egypt made modest efforts in this direction. I just don't think they were more than modest. The third conventional wisdom is that the crucial explanation is the non-proliferation norm. And here too, I think, not irrelevant to the story, but the impact is maybe exaggerated. I think the weaker argument is that the kind of normative taboo convinced Egyptian policymakers not to proliferate. And the reason that I think that's weak, and borrowing from my colleague Jim Walsh at MIT, is that since Egypt was pursuing, at the time, as far as we can tell, chemical and biological weapons, I think it's hard to argue that there was a normative issue, a fundamental normative issue, this is wrong, therefore we shall not do it, where they felt uncomfortable pursuing the weapons, but okay pursuing chemical and biological weapons. I think the stronger normative argument, and it's one that you hear a lot, is that Egypt thought it could pressure Israel in the context of the NPT to give up its nuclear weapons. Now, I think, again, not irrelevant, but I think possibly exaggerated, which is to say, having watched the Israelis put an enormous amount of effort in developing nuclear weapons, being aware of Israeli perceptions of their security situation, I wonder how optimistic Egyptian policymakers actually were that they would successfully disarm Israel's nuclear program through the NPT. And then finally, and I'll just mention it but not unpack it, security assurances from allied states. This one is pretty straightforward. There's some suggestions that the Soviet Union may have extended insurance. On balance, I would say probably not. At the time when there were newspaper reports about it, Nasser strongly denied it. He denied it because he wanted to appear independent. So the last thing that he wanted, and interestingly, this is an element we see today in the region as well, with the relationship with Washington. So I think from the Soviets, at most, maybe an informal assurance. From the Americans, I don't know that an assurance vis-a-vis Israel would have mattered very much. That doesn't mean that political pressure from the Americans wasn't very important. And obviously, Egypt has a close relationship with the United States today that plays a huge, huge role in this area. Some conclusions. I think I promised you conclusions 5 minutes ago, so let me do conclusions round 2. First conclusion, I think Egypt was only modestly motivated to try to get nuclear weapons. As I suggested, Jim Walsh has a really nice quote from his dissertation, sadly unpublished. Every couple months I egg him on to try to publish it. It's a great work, we all refer to it, and I really love the history of the Egyptian nuclear program. And the quote is, the historical record leaves little doubt that the government repeatedly sought the acquisition of nuclear weapons. Yet, it never made the kind of national commitment that would have made the bomb a reality. There was no equivalent to the Manhattan Project or even to Egypt's own Aswan Haidan project. Instead, there was drift, delay, and missed opportunities. And I think that pretty much encapsulates my sense of the program. As for Sadat, why did Sadat want nuclear weapons? Complicated issue, but something that I would like to talk with you more about. My sense is that for both Nasser and Sadat, Israeli nuclear weapons were undesirable. They meant that Egypt could no longer credibly threaten to do certain things to Israel. So Egypt certainly could no longer threaten, if it ever did, but it could no longer credibly threaten to use conventional forces to overrun Israel once Israel had nuclear weapons. But my sense is that nuclear weapons got Israel relatively limited additional coercive leverage. So I'd say Egyptian policymakers were unhappy about Israeli nuclear weapons, but I think we exaggerate sometimes how threatened they were, and in general how threatened countries are by nuclear weapons, given the normative and political constraints on the use of nuclear weapons, or even on nuclear threats. And it seems to me that given their only modest motivations, cost-benefit trade-offs matter a lot. So this is one thing that you see when you kind of play out the nuanced story, is that I think, as I said a couple times now, I think if Egypt had been much wealthier and more technologically developed, it might have nuclear weapons today. It's a tough counterfactual. But given that it was only modestly motivated, the fact that it had to make very costly trade-offs mattered a lot. And finally, one takeaway I take from this, and for a policy audience this is obvious, but I think this story really highlights the crucial importance of individuals. So as international relations scholars, we sometimes treat individuals as though they're not very important to the process, right? So we talk about big systemic processes. And this really, in some respects, is a story about Nasser, it's a story about Sadat, and about their personal preferences. But I just think that's kind of worth highlighting, because as international relations scholars, we often try to abstract away from that level. But if someone other than Sadat had come into power to replace Nasser, the story could have played out very differently. And frankly, even if Nasser was himself somewhat different. I think the story could have played out very differently. So, a couple general conclusions about my more broader conclusions about the issue I used to frame this, which is to say the current situation in the Middle East. What lessons do I draw from this case and from my work more broadly? Well, the Egyptian case is only a single case, but I would draw at least two lessons from it. One, I think it's really interesting that nuclear weapons, seems to me at least, were viewed as primarily status quo reinforcing, even between two countries that were quite intensely antagonistic. Now, one thing we can talk about is, might nuclear weapons in Iran's hand be viewed differently? And there's certainly a plausible case there, and there's certainly lots of rhetoric that suggests they might be. But that's something we can talk about. And the other thing is that given only modest proliferation motivations, trade-offs, costs, and constraints play a huge role. We sometimes tend to think there's this notion that if a country's really determined, it can get nuclear weapons, right? There's this kind of the Pakistan model that we have in mind here. But I'm not sure that's right, even for determined countries. And further, when motivations are modest, we have to think of motivations as a kind of a spectrum, these other factors start to matter a lot. The Egyptian case doesn't allow a lot of traction on some other factors that I think are important that I explored in my dissertation, in particular security guarantees from powerful states, and also dependence on powerful states. You might argue that during and after the peace negotiations in the 70s and afterwards, a sort of dependence on the United States was certainly not irrelevant, but I think this case sheds less light on that than others. And in closing, let me just say, I'm only in Cairo for a couple more days. I've had some interesting interviews so far. I'm still hoping to set up some more. I've been hassling Hagel's office with regular phone calls, because he's one of the few people who can really speak to what's in Nasser's mind. So I'm still hoping to meet with him and a number of other folks, but if you had suggestions for me of people I should reach out to, of literature I should read, in particular things in Arabic that are less accessible to me, I would welcome those. And with that, I think I've gone on a little bit too long, but let's open it up for questions.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. Any questions, comments? Any?
Thank you for talk. I think I have two questions. The first question that comes to my mind is that you framed the question of your investigation in terms of Egypt's response to Israel having nuclear weapons. And by looking at essentially whether or not Egypt has a nuclear program or to what extent they pursued the option of having nuclear weapons, the question is that that is not necessarily the only response that Egypt would have. And so I was wondering whether we could have some kind of a list of possible options and, some kind of a trade-off about why they took this option versus another option. Because they could have taken the Iraqi response, bombing or have some type of military action to sabotage the Israeli system. So that would be one idea, that it would have been interesting if we had, rather than... the second question is the question of whether, Israel having a nuclear weapon and whether or not Egypt would have, also is part of a bigger question, which is what are the possibilities of having regional powers acquiring weapons in the context of the Cold War, whereby the monopoly over that weapon was an important element of that system of mutually assured destruction of the state. So to what extent that the systemic, the nature of the system of the Cold War itself affected to what extent Egypt could have pursued that option in that setting. And in that sense, the question would be how was Israel capable, and its capacity to what precisely was, could be it. The third question that I had in mind, which is there is a conventional wisdom, but I think maybe Ambassador Kennedy might correct me, that in fact Arab countries, even though they understand the Israeli weapon as a serious problem, but they never perceived it as a serious threat. meaning that whether or not anybody at any point during the 1973 or 1960s that Israel was in a position to press the button, I don't think that threat perception was very clear in the minds of the policymakers, but maybe I'm wrong, and that would have also had finally, what is the model that we have about how decisions are made in Egypt? So what are how foreign policy is made and how it's sorry, that's
for others to get their questions out there as well. But let me address them briefly. I agree with you. The question of what is the kind of response set that Egyptian policymakers may have contemplated in response to Israeli proliferation, and how do they weigh that, is a great question. And it's something I thought about a little bit, but what I'm primarily interested in is whether and under what conditions states proliferate. And so as a kind of ancillary question, I'm interested in those other issues, in part because they're quite related, but in a sense that takes me in a little bit of a different direction. But at least off the top of my head, I can think of a little menu. Bombing and full-fledged war are certainly plausible options, and in fact options that Nasser threatened. My own sense is really rhetorically. Some people interpret some of the conflict between Egypt and Israel as relating to this issue and the way in which things played out in 67 and 73 are sometimes interpreted as not irrelevant to the nuclear issue. I would say you're probably in a better position to answer whether that's the case or not, but that certainly is one plausible one. Nasser actually said quite overtly, I think in private conversations with U.S. interlocutors, we are pursuing biological weapons in response to biological weapons pursuit in Israel. So very clear. And I think you can think of biological and chemical weapons pursuit as in part also, and some officials at the time have said we felt comfortable not having nuclear weapons, in part because we had some other capabilities, such as chemical and biological capabilities, and we felt that those were a kind of asymmetric response. And that's not inconceivable. One could imagine, and this is in fact I think something we're seeing in the region now in response to Iran, a conventional arm, right? And so there's this huge arms deal that the Saudis are in the process of doing with the United States, and one can imagine that some countries would feel secure enough with a robust conventional military force not to feel the need to go down the road and have their own nuclear weapons. And then finally, one could imagine making alliance relationships more robust and more formal, perhaps looking for some kinds of formal statements from executives, possibly even something that would a defense pact that would actually be subject to ratification in the U.S. Senate, if that was feasible. I don't have a lot of insight into the kind of internal debates within the Egyptian government about that set of options. My sense is the biological and chemical issues are not irrelevant. I think the conventional weapons issues are not irrelevant. In the absence of some of those others, would the Egyptians have felt the need to do more in the nuclear realm? It's an interesting counterfactual. My sense is those other substitutes are less important than we might think of them. And I think, and this gets to your question about threat, this is something I've been wrestling with, is from a security perspective, how threatened were people actually? Politically, it was intensely undesirable for Israel to have nuclear weapons and Egypt not to have them, no question. But this question of how threatened were Egyptians actually, is a really tough one. And in part because there's a contrast here with Pakistan. So Pakistan perceived a kind of a dire existential threat from India. Whether correct or not, it perceived that. No question that it perceived it. And in particular, it perceived a dire conventional military threat. And my sense is that's the crucial difference between the cases. It's not the proliferation. I actually think that for Pakistan, Indian proliferation was an important secondary motivator, but not the primary motivator. And in fact, I think if India had not gone very far down the nuclear road, Pakistan might well have still tried to acquire nuclear weapons because there was this deep, deep sense of conventional security. And the Indians marshaled their forces in such a way, and the Pakistanis have a lack of strategic depth that made that a not implausible interpretation. But that's an issue I'd love to talk with you more about. It's kind of the threat perception, because it is crucial to the story, and I wish I had more on it. The Cold War question, so the alliance question is a really interesting one. Did the USSR constrain Egypt? So the USSR had quite a close, I think it's fair to call it a patron relationship with Egypt. It was a very big conventional arms supplier to Egypt. From what I know, in the nuclear realm, there doesn't seem to be a lot of pressure on Egypt, which is to say that Nasser had conversations with Khrushchev and others where he spoke quite frankly about the nuclear issue, and he said things like, we're thinking about this issue, we're not sure we're going to go down this path, but we're not closing the door, and we are potentially interested. My sense is, and I don't know why that is, one would expect the Soviet Union to put a lot of pressure on Egypt. So that's, to me, that's sort of an open book. That's an issue I would love to get more information on. And if you have thoughts on the sources on some of those meetings, that would be very helpful. And that's the kind of thing that might well be written up in autobiographies or other sorts of articles. One would expect the Soviet Union to have constrained Egypt. Certainly the United States, once reoriented Egypt's foreign policy from the Soviet Union to the United States, would have been quite significantly constraining Egypt. And I think later on, once there was frankly less interest in Egypt anyway in nuclear weapons, that would have been a very, very significant constraint. I already touched on the Israeli nuclear weapons as a serious political problem, but not a security threat issue. And then you asked sort of what's my model of foreign policy decision making in Egypt. Good question. I mean, my sense is, and many people in the room I think will be more knowledgeable that the way in which decisions were made in the Nasser and later in the Sadat governments, but I think of it as a fairly centralized decision-making model. So I see Nasser making some initial decisions, giving the impetus, for example, to the initial nuclear program, and then keeping quite a hands-on approach. And because he kept quite a hands-on approach, it allowed other people to freelance a little bit. There are lots of other dynamics here that I didn't get a chance to get into. For example, the rivalry with Amer, the kind of concern that a nuclear weapons program might have strengthened a faction within the military. So there are lots of kind of domestic political nuances that we could talk much more about. But my sense is of a fairly centralized decision structure. I'm not a specialist by any means, and this is my first time to Cairo. I'm a proliferation specialist, so I kind of go wherever the nukes are, or are not in this case. So I've done some work relative to the states of the former Soviet Union. I've done some work in Germany, and it's kind of early, even more half-hearted pursuit of nuclear weapons. The Germans did actually very half-heartedly pursue nuclear weapons, which is a fascinating historical tidbit. But also another issue that I would love to chat with you more about if we have a chance. Yes.
Number two, the reason for the fact that we got to pursue the nuclear option, I think that assures you that we have another Islamic country. That's true. But seriously, I think we are very sensitive not back into the equation until 1961. So probably we had no way of being sure that the Israelis will be pursuing the atomic bomb. I have here my messenger to President Nixon, and he is talking about the questions being raised in the Israelis. October 2nd, 1916. Would the Israelis told the United States that they would not possess nuclear weapons? Answer came, Israel will not become a nuclear power. Question number two, would they be willing to affirm that they would not deploy strategic missiles? Answer came that this. They will not deploy strategic missiles until at least 1972. And the last question they raised with Israelis, would Israel be willing to sign the NPT? Answer came, NPT will be considered by the new government. Therefore, that Israel thought that they are not going to sign the NPT. So I'm just saying that actually the United States came late into the equation, and if the United States was not sure about the intention of the Israelis, So I don't think that we could really be that true. The Israelis conceived many facts from the Americans. The officials, the delegation inspectors sent by the Americans to Israel, many things don't conceive from it. Anyhow, what I'd like to highlight that had we looked at that the Israelis had the capabilities, not only had the capabilities, and they had the intention of using it against the program, things would have been done. Now we have governments declassified, saying that the Israelis in 1967 they had 2 devices, and they were ready to use it. As early as 67. In 73, I think it's very well documented, the Israelis already put their Jericho missiles on alert, and they had the bombs on the Jericho missiles. And the Israelis informed the Americans in 73 that if I had to use it because the first days they suffered a lot. So what I'm trying to add is that Egypt is, I think, kept in the dark, as also the American side. Number 2, probably if we had the own area that the Israelis have a substantial program of changing our mind. Number 3, in spite of everything, we, and as you correctly said, we developed our infrastructure from the beginning. And we have the Al-Shas one but still. Again, we have the Argentine reactor. And we developed, and we have now, we have a good scientific base. So even if we not aspire to the nuclear option, we managed to keep ourselves rather very much ahead when it comes to infrastructure
Really appreciate those questions. I agree. Egypt, by not pursuing the program, has signaled that it is a peace-loving country. But I do think the issue is more complicated than that. In terms of Kissinger and Nixon, my own sense is that you give them a little too much of the benefit of the doubt. Under the Kennedy administration, there was substantial pressure on Israel not to proliferate, to roll back its efforts. My sense is that in the Nixon administration, there was a kind of modus operandi that was reached, and it was an understanding that was reached that Israel would, as is famously quoted, not be the first to introduce nuclear weapons into the Middle East, but also not the second. Which, parsing that makes your head spin a little bit. But I think that I would put that a little bit more in the category of political theater than I would Kissinger and Nixon being unaware of what the Israelis were doing. My sense is that the Americans were aware of quite a lot. And the nice thing is that we have at this point, because of the 30-year rule, a lot of declassified information. And I think there's a pretty good sense that in the Nixon administration, there was a pretty robust idea of what the Israelis were doing. And the United States basically reached an agreement which crucially required the Israelis not to go public, to adopt this kind of open posture, which has persisted to the present day. One of my soon-to-be colleagues, Edward Cohen, has just published a book where he argues that it's time for Israel to reject this posture, to move on, to publicly declare its nuclear weapons, so that it can engage with the nuclear discourse internationally, including the disarmament discourse that has increasingly come back onto the front burner again. But my sense is not that the Americans were particularly in the dark, and I tried to suggest that during my talk, and even not that the Egyptians were particularly in the dark. So I think they could have had even more clarity, but I don't think they would have said with a straight face at the time, oh, we had no idea. You tell me the Israelis were pursuing Grudge, I'm shocked, just deeply shocked. I don't think that would have been their honest reaction in an off-the-record conversation. This issue of intentions to use them is really interesting because it relates to my argument, and I think supports it, which is I don't think that the Egyptians felt that an Israeli nuclear threat was very credible, and there were some kind of opaque threats, right? And there was suggestions, for example, there have been suggestions over the years that nuclear weapons might be used against the Aswan Dam and floods of central parts of Egypt. I mean, the Israelis have not always held back on provocative rhetoric that encompasses their nuclear weapons. We should be clear about that. But in general, they have been opaque about their nuclear posture, and I think, as I suggested, that is not irrelevant to how the story played out. And certainly there would have been more pressure in Egypt. How much pressure is really hard to wrestle with, right? If the public is really clamoring for nuclear weapons, do you have to? Does it just put a little bit more pressure on you? Does it just enable you to take the policy actions you want to take anyway as a policymaker? But I think you raised...
I share most of your conclusions, in fact, except for one, which I will deal with later. First of all, in response to the question why did Nasser sign the NPT, I think handling and help us with that. Well, President Clinton signed the law statutes without ever having the intention of ratifying it. Signing creates rights. And you can participate in discussions about the influence of I would like to analyze, in fact, Nasser's position. The sources of power in Egypt are much larger than those of Israel. So, it remains for Egypt to develop its own sources of power before getting to nuclear. And I agree with you that if Egypt had been more technologically advanced, then it would have developed nuclear power, because Israel may have felt a threat from Egypt. Second, I think that Egypt never had the intention of, never had offensive intentions towards Israel, even under Nasser. And therefore, they concluded that Israel would never use its nuclear arms against Israel. Because in fact, you cannot imagine Israel using a nuclear weapon and then sending a MacArthur to Egypt. The difference, the proportions is so huge that you cannot imagine a MacArthur ruling over Egypt like MacArthur did in Japan. So I think the question of relations, power relations, is extremely important, and it's not just the nature of the weapon. And of course, just in case, they developed bacteriological weapons, just in case, the weapon of the war. Now, with regard to Iran, I can understand that Egypt raises questions about whether it develops nuclear weapons in response to Israel development. Because developing nuclear weapons in response to the second state introducing nuclear weapons in the region, this would be absolutely absurd. It would be absurd. Because in fact, the second state developing nuclear weapons in the region is a guarantee for Egypt. It's an insurance for Egypt. Rather than
balance.
Of course. And then the nature of conflict between Egypt and Iran, if conflict there is, the nature of conflict is different. It's not a territorial conflict. It's a conflict over influence in the region, where Iran already exerts influence in Iran. Iran does not need nuclear weapons from the Gulf states. Come on. Iran has already sufficient power for the Gulf states. Iran, in fact, is a similar case to France. France developed a nuclear weapon as a defensive weapon. Iran may, assuming that it wants to develop a nuclear weapon, it would only be manufacturing the research, the teaching that Israel emphasizes this time and again. And they compare Iran's drive to France's drive in the late 50s and early 60s. So this is what I have.
I'm not sure I disagree with much of that, so I think I'll maybe take that as a comment. Let me see if I can read the comment. Well, I mean, this question of Iran is just Iran is fully benign because it's just balance with the Israeli nuclear program. It certainly seems like it should be part of the dynamic. I wonder whether it's that simple. And I wonder whether a region that has not one opaque, but two opaque, or maybe no longer opaque nuclear powers, right? You can imagine, at least if the Israelis follow Cohen's advice, that maybe the Israelis go public at some point, not following Cohen's advice, but because they feel the need to do that in the context of what Iran is doing. If Iran makes the decision, which I don't think they've made, to go all the way, which is to say to actually test and deploy nuclear weapons, you imagine a region with two nuclear powers. I imagine, you would know better than I know, that there would be some pressure within Egypt to respond. And let's take it further, right? I mean, of the three countries that are often identified as being potential belligerents in response to Iran, Saudi Arabia is perhaps the most compelling one. Okay, so let's say you have Israel, you have an Iran, and you have Saudi Arabia. I mean, at that point, Egypt aspires to or likes to see itself as playing a leadership role in the region. And I think at that point there would certainly be some pressure perceived here to go down that route. I don't think we should exaggerate that. My own sense is most people exaggerate it. But I wouldn't dismiss it entirely. Maybe you would, and that's interesting to me. But my own sense is at that point, but I see what you're saying. I mean, if Israel is really viewed as the primary threat, and Iran is primarily viewed as balancing Israel, then in a sense, maybe we are of course also too optimistic about the Cold War, right? In retrospect, it was very stable and safe, and there are a lot of things we know about the Cold War now that make it very much less so. But I think it's an interesting and provocative comment, and I agree with at least some of them. Let's go to the back.
Not a piece of speculation. The Egyptian missile project fell apart in 1965. At the same time that the Americans stopped giving aid to Egypt because of the Egyptian position on the Vietnam War. So, and that shows you generally the level of seriousness concerning militarization of convention. The other thing is, I just remembered something. When the Cuban Missile Crisis happened and it was resolved, Castro was furious. He called Khrushchev a beer with no balls. Castro called Khrushchev a beer with no balls. And also before that, Mao Zedong was eager for nuclear war to happen to a large population in the West. We can survive, and Khrushchev was talking about it. It could be that Nasser and the decision makers didn't really understand what a nuclear war would look like. It took a long time for both even the Soviets and the Americans to figure out exactly what the fallout would be and what effect it had on the stratosphere and how to survive it. I mean, it took a long time to figure those things out, and I think the learning curve is still much longer over here. We're thinking it to the same level of Castro's thinking about it. So that from the other bigger population, when they hit us, we can still win if it really comes to a real war. That's my experience.
Reference age to change. If you want to talk about taboos and political constraints, that's not a constant, right? That's something that evolves over time. But my sense is that even at the time, there was a fairly strong appreciation of the kind of power of nuclear weapons, and in a sense, they were mythologized maybe more than they are now. So it's kind of played in both ways. We have a better understanding of how scientifically the effects they actually have, but at the same time, they were more mysterious, and in that sense, I think also seemed more powerful. So I think that one plays both ways. But it's a good point. And do we really know how they perceive nuclear weapons? No. I mean, that's in a sense what I'm trying to get at indirectly. I mean, anyway, I can. Thank you. Yes.
Well, I have to actually, I don't know about AUC and really programs than my own program, but what I know about the Egyptian program, that actually it was not a reaction to it started early on, and basically the direction that the government wants at the time is to have nuclear infrastructure, full stop. That's why we have so many scientists in the West and so many in the US as well to be trained for the nuclear program, and we started with the reactor in Al-Shas, which is anyway the research reactor, and it's very strong. And maybe that is why at the end it led NASA to sign the NPT, because if we look at the sequence of events, we've never really had a political will to develop nuclear weapons as such. And when you negotiations that we had with the other countries, the nuclear powers at the time, you mentioned so many times this to be leading to requests for nuclear weapons supply. But it can't be just testing waters. When we are in negotiations, we always try to figure out what we can gain from these negotiations. We maximize our goals, and then we see what we can reach. So that's why maybe it's quite doubtful that we really wanted to have nuclear weapons. When it comes to Israel, well, I can't say that the U.S. did not know. Actually, it turned a blind eye to what was going on. During Kennedy administration, we sent investigation scientists who did not speak Hebrew and did not know what was going on in Dimona. In 1967, at least now the available literature shows that we had agents, intelligence agents in Israel who actually notified the Egyptian government that there was already fuel in the centrifuges in Dimona and that the reactors are working towards a nuclear weapons. The other thing is, I think when it comes to the threat issue, why we've never taken that serious as Arabs, because it started, the Israeli nuclear program started against the Soviet Union, not against the Arabs. It was the Samson option, as Samuel Hirsch said in his book. So it's basically not against us. Later on, it served Israel in 1973, when Golda Meir actually told the President of the U.S. that they have nuclear weapons. Then they got support from the U.S. administration at the time. It's very difficult to actually make a comparison between the Egyptian situation and the Pakistani situation, because Pakistan got a lot of support for this program, not only the political will. I wonder if during Nasser's time, or even during Saddam's time, at any point in time, if we wanted to have nuclear weapons, we would get support for that. As far as the Iranian threat, maybe I agree with you when it comes to the leadership, but also when we look at the broader context of the NPT as non-nuclear weapons state, it would be very difficult to agree that we are abiding by all the rules of the NPT and then we have another regional power next door to have nuclear weapons. It would be very difficult because it will actually lead to the collapse of the whole NPT, why we are members of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. A couple of quick responses. You say that you think it's doubtful that Egypt wanted nuclear weapons and that maybe in the negotiations they were just seeing how far they could push. The fact that they repeatedly sent high-level delegations whose core request was to ask, might you be willing to transfer nuclear weapons to us? Maybe they were expecting the answer to be no, but it suggests to me at least some desire on their part to have nuclear weapons. So if they did fail, maybe they expected to fail. I actually think that, their desire for nuclear weapons was quite half-hearted, but it is my sense that we have enough information. I just want to clarify, the reason that I caveated those statements repeatedly is that they're based on a relatively small number of interviews that my colleagues have done, not that I did, in part because a number of these people have sadly passed away in the intervening years. So Jim Walsh was here, I guess about 8 or 10 years ago, and Ray Ross-Bruley was here a couple of years ago. And they gave me a long list of their contacts, and I went through them with Mohammed Shaker, and he crossed out about 2/3 of them, just dead. It was very impressive for me, not only because people have died, but because people I'd really like to talk to are no longer available, except maybe through a Ouija board or something. But the Egyptian agents in Dimona, if there is a source for that, I'd love to get that. That was not something I was aware of that I had found elsewhere, so I'd love to chat with you about that. You said, I think, that the Egyptian program, to the extent that it had weapons motivation, was motivated against the Soviet Union. Did I understand you correctly? The Israeli program, yes, that's true. So the Israeli, yes, definitely. Yeah. Oh, and for that reason, Egypt didn't feel so threatened. Sorry, I didn't think that connection. Well, I certainly think Egypt didn't feel that threatened, although I think it's easy, in retrospect, to downplay how threatened we felt at the time. So I think the relationship was fairly antagonistic, but very good point on the Israeli program. And in terms of Pakistan getting support, it's entirely true, and some people might argue that that's the crucial distinction here. My sense is Pakistan also sought support much more robustly. And maybe the Egyptians didn't seek support as robustly because they kind of knew they were going to fail. They did seek support, but it was much more half-hearted. So they would reach out to countries and then they would not follow up. They would put out tenders for nuclear reactors and then they would let it, for 6 months, for a year, they would kind of let things lag. There wasn't a sense of urgency, as I tried to suggest in that quote from Jim Walsh. It was a very kind of, we'll try it, but it's not a priority, and we're not going to push it. And so that's kind of the overall. All of this is nuance, right? All of this is kind of in some gray zone. So that makes it tricky. Maybe that's all of social science. But yeah, I appreciate all your comments on the cost of the NPT. I think my own sense is that's exaggerated, but not irrelevant. I think if Iran gets nuclear weapons, and certainly if another regional state gets nuclear weapons, we're going to have a big problem in our hands in terms of NPT negotiations. That is dramatically understating the case. But I think maybe collapse of NPT is I think we may be reaching the witching hour. It's 20.
Any last questions? Or we'll just take one last question and then we'll close.
I just have a quick one. Going off your emphasis on not a neo-realist or the liberalist worldview, this may be a bit of a counterfactual, but have you come across anything that would suggest that had Ivan not had such a meh reaction to learning that the Israelis were pursuing a nuclear program that could have dramatically altered the Egyptian-Israeli dynamic, considering how the U.S. and Israel have their kind of frosty relationship right now?
So there's a kind of convention. The nuclear program was a second or third tier priority. Other things mattered more to them, but I think they were not unconcerned about the Israeli nuclear weapons program, and if they could have, they would have stopped it. That's my own sense. So could Eisenhower have done more early? Could the American government have done more? Definitely. And they were making cost-benefit trade-offs versus other national priorities. Would they have been able to stop it? Hard to say. I mean, the Israelis, especially with French support, were in a pretty good place to develop nuclear weapons. And I think American leverage over Israel at that point, it depends. And you could play the counterfactual in a couple ways. But certainly it would have changed the dynamic. The Americans could have put much more pressure early onto the Israelis, and maybe the Israelis wouldn't have gone so far. Maybe they would have been forced to go public. There are all kinds of ways in which this could have played out differently. So, well, thank you very much for this opportunity, and thank you, Ambassador.